Okay, welcome to this panel. This is the first of two panels on worker cooperatives. My name is Craig Borowiak. I am Associate Professor of Political Science at Haverford College. I'm also one of the co-organizers of the conference. I just want to say a brief word about why I'm particularly interested in this panel and the second worker cooperative panel as well, before giving a brief introduction of the panelists, and then we'll just turn it over to them to give us some cases. We know that the current economy is dominated by capitalist forms. We also know that capitalist economies are very powerful. Capitalist forms are very, very powerful. There are many benefits that capitalist firms and markets can generate in terms of innovation, in terms of efficiency, although there are limits to these things. But we also know that the capitalist forms have certain constraints, certain limitations, and generate certain problems. That there are problems inherent in the capitalist enterprise. And one of those problems has to do with the fundamental separation between owners and workers. It's an undemocratic separation. So rather than empowering workers to become democratically active members in their workplaces and teaching them skills of democratic management that they can take into their broader society, capitalist firms, with their separation of workers and owners, disempower individuals. We know that the separation between workers and owners is also a basis for alienation, which has been well studied. Worker cooperatives, while many of them are thoroughly plugged into the mainstream economy, do one thing for sure that is different. They provide an alternative with regard to the internal structure of the workplace. They overcome the structural division between workers and owners, at least in principle, often in practice. I think is one of the most empowering lessons to take from the concept of the worker cooperative. There's something else we know about worker cooperatives, is that they've had a checkered history. For a century, theorists have told us that worker cooperatives are unviable. They are unviable because they are too insular, because they have trouble financing, because they are inherently conservative, because they don't link up to the broader worker economies. On the other hand, we know that there are some very successful examples of worker cooperatives that defy this logic. One of the most prominent examples being Mondragon in Spain, which is a large complex of worker cooperatives. So here, to learn more about the potential of worker cooperatives and also the limits of worker cooperatives, we've created a panel of academics who have done case studies of four. We have three panelists who will present on worker cooperatives in Wisconsin-Madison. We have one panelist who will present an example of a worker cooperative in Philadelphia. So with that brief introduction, let me introduce the actual panelists. First, we have Ann Reynolds from the University of Wisconsin Center for Cooperatives. She is the assistant director of the Center for Cooperatives. She has deep roots in the cooperative economy in Madison and Wisconsin generally. She is also one of the co-organizers of the conference. She will be presenting on an industrial cooperative called Isthmus, and she will go first. Second, we have Joel Pashansky from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is a graduate student in sociology. They're working with Eric Olin Wright, helping to theorizing some of these alternatives. He will present on a cooperative called Just Coffee Cooperative. A coffee, we'll learn more about what exactly Just Coffee is, but a coffee cooperative. Third is Trevor Young-Hyman from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is also a graduate student of sociology there. He will be presenting on Union Cab, a taxi cab cooperative in Wisconsin. And then finally, Dottie Ives Dewey from the Department of Geography and Planning at Westchester University is going to be presenting on Greensaw Design and Build. It is a local Philadelphia cooperative, a new cooperative that does custom carpentry. So let me turn it over to Ann Reynolds to give our first presentation.
Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here, really pleased to be here in Philadelphia after having worked with Craig and Richard and Bob, our little merry band of co-organizers. It's just wonderful to see this overflow crowd and all the enthusiasm, and I'm really looking forward with all of you to the rest of the day. So thank you. Very glad to also be here to talk about Isthmus Engineering and Manufacturing Cooperative. Actually, I worked with Trevor Janheimen, who's one of the co-panelists, on a case study of Isthmus. And so if there's anything I don't know and you ask questions, we'll definitely turn to Trevor because we worked together on this and really had a really interesting experience as we were really delving deeply, had an opportunity to interview about 25 worker members. And then this is, one of our actually first opportunities to present some of the results of our case study research. So very glad to be here. I should note I've got a PowerPoint, and I'm actually using one that in the framework was put together by Isthmus, by the cooperative. And they shared it with me. They, of course, know that we're presenting this case here. And I think that it's worth sharing a little bit how they see themselves, because this is part of a presentation that they made to a cooperative group in Madison, Cooperation Works, which some of you may know is a co-op development organization. And Isthmus used much of this to present themselves. And I thought that would be a way of kind of bringing them into the room, because Isthmus is a fairly small cooperative. There's about 50 employees, and I just sort of feel like they're here with me as I make this presentation. So glad to be here. Isthmus is a worker-owned cooperative. We said it's located in Madison, Wisconsin. There's a few things just to sort of summarize that really do make it a fascinating case. First of all, they're going to celebrate their 30th anniversary next year. And so that's pretty remarkable, staying power. There's still several of the founders of the cooperative are still members, but they will be retiring soon. And so we'll be looking at the next sort of stage of Isthmus. But I think one of the things that is additionally remarkable about them is that they come out of a very strong manufacturing industry, particularly in the auto side of it, in the upper Midwest, and they are the last of their competitors still standing. So most of the design, concept design, build, custom manufacturing organizations that were strong in the upper Midwest for many, many years, mostly based in the auto manufacturing industry, are gone. They're either overseas or they've just completely dissolved. So another, I think, very fascinating thing, when you walk into Isthmus, it doesn't really feel like any other engineering firm. But once you start to talk to people, you realize how radically different the work environment is at Isthmus Engineering. They have democratized not only the governance and ownership of that cooperative, but the workplace. And Isthmus is an organization, as you'll see, that is actually owned by more than 50% of its members. And we'll talk a little bit about how that membership evolves for the people who work there. But at the basic workplace level, and we interviewed people who were members and non-members in every single job category at Isthmus, democracy really prevails. And so Isthmus is almost an inspiring place to be. And they have a commitment to their values. And so after 30 years, this is an organization that is continually reevaluating its democratic workplace, and I think actually growing stronger rather than weaker in its commitment to the cooperative model. So as I said, it was established in 1980. At the time it was established, most of its business was within a 5-mile radius of the organization. It was established as a partnership first, which included engineers, mechanical engineers, and some non-engineers. And it quickly, when they converted to a cooperative based on the sort of inspiration from Mondragon, they included right from the beginning assemblers and non-engineers. So it's important to understand this is not just a sort of cooperative engineering partnership. They differentiated themselves right from the start by including any category of worker in the cooperative. Yes, they have 50% of their employees are mechanical and electrical engineers, and about 30 of the employees are members. They have 15 million in annual sales, and the kind of work that they do is now diverse. It was in the auto industry when it started, but they have diversified over the as the challenges of the auto industry, well known to everybody, have happened. They are big in medical, solar, green technology, light industrial. They make the machines that automate manufacturing processes, still mostly national, a little bit global. So again, how do they do it? You know, robotics, assembly. I'm not an expert for sure. Maybe some of you in the audience know more about what some of these things involve, but they are not only designing the machines, but they're building them on the factory floor. They deliver them to the customer. They oversee the installation wherever the customer is, and then they continue to troubleshoot these machines on their customer's floor for as long as their contract lasts. They're a project-based company. This is very important. It puts them, it makes them similar to many similar engineering firms. Project-based companies are all over the place. Of course, we all know that team-based ways to get things done in a team-based way is not unique to a cooperative. But what is unique is that the team is made up of engineers, assemblers, mechanical people, and everyone who may have a hand in this project. And the openness with which all of the people that we spoke to talked about in terms of communicating with each other, making sure that the quality is high. One of the things that we witnessed was a Wednesday lunch, which they have for employees and non-end members. So every Wednesday, 50 people get together in a room, and they go through project by project. Where are they in terms of profitability, in terms of the timeline, in terms of the resources and that's the human resources usually that are needed for that project. And the team leader describes the project. They go through it like this, and the entire company has a deep understanding of what's happening in their business. It's pretty impressive to see, and there are questions. So lots and lots of transparency in this organization. So a few nice pictures of the kinds of things that they do, since we can't do a live tour. These are some of the machines. They do make pacifiers, or they have. So what they do is they take on the challenge of how can we make pacifiers more quickly or higher quality. That's what their customers are looking for when they go to ISMAS. Biscuit loading. All right. They're very interested in solar, and they've been challenged by some of the policy decisions that have been made that has made it harder for them to get into that industry. Some of you might be aware of that. But they do form partnerships, and they do have some really strong partnerships with the companies that they work with. So now a little bit about the co-op structure. All members sit on the board of directors, and that's about 30. They meet every 2 weeks, and they make the major decisions for that organization. They do have an executive committee, but we found that the executive committee is not really empowered to do a whole lot. They have a very flat and very lean management structure. And one of the things that anybody who works there now uses to compare Isthmus with their previous workplace is the sort of flattened structure. They just don't have the hierarchy that most organizations have, and so getting things done is through their project and their team and their committee structure. The two managers, sales and the general manager, cannot be members, but otherwise membership is open to all. Everybody starts as an employee. They're paid competitive wages within their industry, and after 2 years, they can apply to buy in for ownership. 90% vote is required from the members if you're to validate an ownership, and at that point, that person becomes a member and pays a fairly substantial membership fee, because as they say, they are buying into a successful and business. And they are, at that point, are also taking risks with the other co-owners of that business. We also, though, talk to a lot of people who have chosen not to become members. And so it isn't a requirement. And non-members, as I said, do participate in that democratic workplace structure. They can also serve on some of the committees. So this is really the last slide. I've gone through this fairly quickly, but just so that you can see, the board of directors has a number of committees. Those committees are very active. We talk to them. They make a lot of the decisions. For instance, you see their office tools and tech. Those are the ones that are putting forward proposals to buy new computers. And they bring that from the very grassroots level up to the board of directors for decisions about purchases and marketing, finance. These are the groups that really run this organization. And the two managers have important positions, but they are not in charge of the company in any way. So quite interesting to hear how they keep that very flat and lean structure. I think the only other thing that I'd just like to end with is that the challenges ahead for Isthmus really in many ways have to do with growth. They've been at about 50 employees for a number of years, and it's not totally clear how they would grow, whether they would and so that's definitely one of the things that they are thinking about. Or do they need to grow? Can they do this through continued partnerships? They're looking at Mondragon and how they've done handled their growth, and they're certainly. But I think bottom line, they feel that they have gathered together an incredibly talented group of people, that they work well together, and that they're basically ready to meet the challenges of the next 30 years too. So, thank you very much.
I should just add quickly that I gave them 10 minutes for their presentation. Obviously, there's a lot more to say about each of these cases, but I've given them the sometimes impossible task of cramming it all into a very short time period. Okay, Joel Peschansky will present next.
So, hi everyone, my name is João Peschansky, and I thank Craig and everyone who is participating in the organization of this wonderful conference. And I'm going to present the case of Just Coffee, which is a small coffee roaster, which is worker-owned from Madison, Wisconsin. And I'm going to exclusively focus on its business model. In general, one thing that comes up when we think of cooperatives in the economic literature is that some folks say, okay, you build a cooperative, but the constraints that you're going to have to face in the economy are going to be so big, so overwhelming, that the nice idea that you start up with is going to progressively going to become perverted. And the small cooperative, they only have 7 members and 4 employees that was created in 2001, has actually, at least, it's an ongoing process, but at least in part, come up with an interesting solution to solve the constraints of the general economy in which you need to build cooperatives. And that's what I'm going to focus on. So I'm not going to talk about the internal structure of Just Coffee, and I'm happy to talk about during the Q&A. And I would like also to acknowledge that this research that I did on Just Coffee that was done in 2010 had the support of the UW Madison Center for Cooperative, and in a lot of way was instigated by another piece of one of my colleagues who is here, Molly Noble, who also wrote a piece on Just Coffee and is going to present later today. So the original idea of Just Coffee in 2001, when it was created, was to provide resources to impoverished rural producers in Chiapas, Mexico. The 2 founders, a graduate student at the UW-Madison and a small farmer from Wisconsin, were part of solidarity campaigns to help the rural producers from this region that made the highlights because of constant conflicts between some social movements, separatist movements, and the Mexican government. And at first, the way they would go back and forth to Chiapas, and the rural producers there would ask them to, by any means, try to find resources to help their communities, and they tried to organize stuff in Madison. And at some point, what became more tangible possibility was to create a co-op that would bring the resources, the production, from Chiapas to Madison and sell it there. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, sorry. Is it better? Okay, sorry about that. And please interrupt me if my accent is really bad. I'm not a native speaker. I'm from Brazil, so I understand sometimes it's hard. So these 2 founders, so they had the idea of creating a co-op, a coffee roaster co-op in Madison. And they went for some advices in Madison about how to do it. And basically, all the more well-known institutions, including the UW Business School that had set up a project to help small business, said, okay, what you're trying to do is just impossible. But they continued with their project, and they received help from a small nonprofit, the Madison Development Corporation, and they put a lot of money of their own. At the beginning, until up to 2007, Just Coffee went through a period that the members call a financial chaos, in which they oscillated between losses and profit, and several times they considered shutting down the business. And up to 2008, they actually reached an equilibrium in their finance, and that's where in my sense, the most interesting part starts on how you can actually build an interesting model, an alternative model, transformative model, when you have at least the basic of the startup done. So what is interesting about Just Coffee is that they are committed to a socially just business model in which they have very special relationships between the producers and Just Coffee and its customers. So one part of it is that they pay, in general, they negotiate with the producers in now not only Chiapas, but also many other countries in the third world, what the price of the pound of beans is going to be. In general, it's twice as high as even the fair trade movement generally gives, and it makes real changes in the communities from which they buy. All the producers' communities that they buy from are themselves cooperatives, and they try to really put an emphasis on this co-op to co-op aspect. But it's not only about pricing. They are also developing strategies to pre-finance the production so that producers do not face the threat of, I don't know, bad weather, losing all their production, and not being able to survive for a year. So they try to appease the general threat of market pressure on the side of these vulnerable producers. And on the part of the customers, what they do is that all the products, all the coffee that they roast comes into labels. There are basically informative labels that explains what the supply chain of where the coffee comes from, what is paid for to the producers, what is paid for the roasting, what is paid for the wages of the employees, what is paid for the maintenance of the cooperative is very well explained. So they really focus on transparency. So when you buy coffee from Just Coffee, you know exactly what you're buying. You know how much of the money you're spending is actually going to the producers, how much is going to pay the workers of Just Coffee. And they also have this idea of strengthening the bonds between producers in third world countries and people in Madison. So they develop delegations. They organize delegations every year so that customers from Madison go to these third world countries, and sometimes they bring producers from the third world countries to come to Madison and strengthening the bonds between the two general opposite poles of the supply chain. Another aspect is that they are strongly involved in the Madison community. So they voluntarily take part of protests. They were very involved in the Capitol occupation against Scott Walker that Ger Alberovitz, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, mentioned in the previous conference. And they only sell, or they mostly sell, they only sell coffee to markets that they consider friendly. So 50% of their sales go to co-ops, and that's a way of stimulating the existence of more and more co-ops in Madison. Every time that they have a new potential client, someone to sell coffee to, they go and they do a fact check about this person or this organization that is interested in buying their coffee, and they decide whether or not to sell the coffee. So, for instance, they decide that not to sell to a very large grocery store that they disagree with part of their the working conditions in this place. So, very briefly, Just Coffee, what is interesting about it is that it sort of deals in an interesting way with this tension that exists for a lot of co-ops, that is to be sustainable. Just Coffee is making over $1 million in sales every year. So even though it's a small coffee roaster, it's large enough to have an economic impact. And the other part, that is the mission. In the way that they talk about it, they say, we take very seriously the fair aspect of the fair trade movement. And this is a tension because they could be selling to this grocery store and make more sales and be more profitable, but that would go against the mission. So it's a continuing balance between what to do and what is important. In the way that they put it is a sort of community peer pressure that they get from Madison. So when they only sell to co-op, or when they get customers involved, that helps them, or that gives them incentives to keep their mission very closely in tune with their business. Thank you.
Next is Trevor Young-Hyman.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to present today on Union Cab, Taxi Cooperative of Madison. As the name suggests, they are a taxi company that's organized as a worker cooperative, one of the only democratic worker cooperative taxi companies in the country, but there are others, one of which, thank you, one of which is Yellow Cab Taxi Cooperative in San Francisco. So they're not completely unique, but they are quite unique. This was relatively a new case to me when I was asked to do this presentation. So I did a number of interviews. I did about half a dozen interviews with various worker members within the business. I sat in on some afternoons in the shop and in the offices. I got to look at some newsletters and some historical documents. But this is relatively preliminary research, and I hope to do more. But at least I hope that this gives you a sense of the company and maybe evokes some ideas, thinking more broadly about worker cooperatives in general. Like I said, there's some practical value to this case. It's an interesting and unusual case to have a worker cooperative in the taxi industry. And so maybe that's a practical value of this case. But I think that as I've learned more about this company, some of their experiences speak to some of the broader theoretical or sort of conceptual issues that worker cooperatives face. Sort of like Joao was sort of focusing in, there are so many different dimensions of worker cooperatives to be examined. I could have picked a bunch of different ones, but I decided to focus on two in particular. One was the foundation of the company, and the second is the governance structure and the evolution of the governance structure. So what I'm going to do is just briefly present the case and then delve more deeply into those two dimensions of it. So the company was founded in 1979 by 5 Madison taxi drivers who had been working for another company, but had been part of labor organizing activities. They had organized a union within one of their companies. They had started to negotiate with the owner. The negotiations had stalled. There were strikes. The strikes went nowhere. They were not resolved. And finally, these 5 drivers just left and formed a cooperative. Since then, the company has grown. They now have 240 member owners. It's quite a large business. And their business is divided between call service, so you call up the company and they come pick you up. But they also, 40% of their business comes from negotiated contracts with various public and private organizations in Madison. So they provide transport services to medical service providers in the city, to the school system. Over time, they've provided transport services with the city of Madison. So that's been an important source of revenue for them and a way to manage the peaks and valleys of seasonal changes in traffic. Today, they bring in about $6 million a year in annual revenue. Like I said, they have 240 members, and those members are distributed across 6 occupational disciplines. You have IT professionals, and they claim to be one of the only, or if not the only, taxi company in Madison that has its own IT department. They have a maintenance department of mechanics and custodians. They have dispatchers. They have accountants. They have some full-time managers and drivers. And the drivers make up a significant proportion of the workforce. Almost 190 of the 240 workers are drivers. Like I said, it's a democratically governed worker cooperative, 1 member, 1 vote. After a 6-month probationary period, members are essentially obliged to apply for membership. And it's a $25 buy-in to become a member. They have an elected internal board of directors, and it's a competitive election. They serve 2-year terms. And then beyond that, as I'll talk about more, there's extensive participation in a range of committees and various governance mechanisms. I should also mention, as Joao mentioned about Just Coffee, this organization has been highly involved with a range of alternative economy initiatives outside of their business. They organized a cooperatives for labor protest during the Capitol protests. They've been highly involved with the Madison Association of Worker Cooperatives, both contributing resources, funding the organization, which provides support services to startup co-ops and does best practice sharing among local co-ops. And they also contributed, they contribute resources to, there was a recent conference on economic development, cooperatives and economic development, and I believe they contributed something like $2,000 to help fund that conference. I should also note that in conversations with the members, they mentioned to me that there's not total consensus about this, that there's debate and there's diversity in the political views of the members. Republicans, Democrats. One guy was described as, one of our guys has a bunch of BMWs at home, and he really values this because he really likes to make money. And so he works a ton of hours, and it's a really good source of income for him. Other people who work in this business, they kind of do it for the health care, because every worker gets health care as part of their compensation. And on this note, some of the members are extremely active in local politics, and they use the cooperative as a mechanism for that. And other workers just use the cooperative as a source of income. So I want to focus on these two particular dimensions of the business. First, the foundation, and then second of all, the governance structure. Why the foundation? Why does the foundation matter? Well, we often talk about how efficient are cooperatives and why do they succeed or fail, but another question is, why are they started or not started in the first place? And this is something that's come up in some recent research on the topic, but it's a useful question for two reasons. One is that in order to start a cooperative, you need essentially collaboration on the part of a bunch of potential founders, and they have to believe that the effort that they put in is going to be rewarded. You might say that there's a collective action problem. So one might think, why should I work as hard as I can to found this organization if I'm going to share the fruits of my labor with a bunch of other founders who may not work as hard as me and who I can't necessarily effectively monitor because my attention is focused on doing what I'm doing. I can't perfectly observe them, and technically they're my equal. They're co-founders as well. So this is sort of an obstacle to the founding of worker cooperatives. The second piece is just a lack of familiarity. Many people don't know what a worker cooperative is. So maybe that's an explanation of why there are relatively fewer worker co-ops. They just don't come onto the radar screen. So what has been the experience of Union Cab? Well, first of all, I think it's really important to note that the founders of Union Cab all came out of this common struggle, and they had a common hope, and that was essentially to form a workplace where they could manage themselves, where they did not have this conflictual management relation. Negotiations had failed with management at their previous employer, and so in a sense, there were, beyond the financial incentives of creating a worker co-op, there were significant non-financial incentives to them. The opportunity to work in a self-managed workplace, which might help to explain how they were able to overcome this issue. And the other piece of that is that they had worked together before, so there was a dimension of trust there. And then in terms of the visibility and the awareness component of just the idea of cooperatives, as João has mentioned and as has become increasingly apparent to me, during this period of time in the late 70s in Madison, there was a lot of cooperative activity going on. A number of the cooperatives from Madison being discussed today were in the process of formation. There were legal institutions with specialization in cooperative law and forming cooperatives. And it turns out that the same quasi-public organization, the Madison Development Corporation, which helped fund Just Coffee, also helped to fund Union Cab. So that played an important role. Often financing is seen as a key obstacle to cooperative formation. And it turns out actually that the largest source of funding to create Union Cab came from a private bank. First Wisconsin Bank gave $90,000 of the $150,000 they needed to start the company. But importantly, the rest of it came from a quasi-public institution, this Madison Development Corporation, and also from the sale of preferred stock to local community members, family members, and even one of the lawyers who helped to set up the cooperative gave some money. So all these sort of enabling institutions, and this very much reminds me of some of the research that gets done on innovation clusters and Silicon Valley and the importance of these local networks for promoting high-tech startups. Well, maybe you have the same sort of thing going on with cooperatives. The second piece I wanted to talk about is this dimension of governance. So often the argument is made that one of the key sources of inefficiency for worker cooperatives is the cost of governance. So instead of having one owner who makes all the decisions and makes a cost-benefit analysis according to his or her interests, you have a whole set, in this case, of 240 owners who have to make a collective decision. And not only do they have to weigh the costs and benefits, but these decisions are affecting their day-to-day lives. So think about the example of adopting a new radio system, making the investment in a new radio system for the taxi cooperative. Well, in addition to whether this is going to generate additional revenue, you also have to consider how this is going to affect the lives of the drivers. So maybe the audio quality is better, so there's an additional non-monetary incentive for them, but at the same time, it requires learning on the part of the dispatchers. So the idea is that you have these additional governance costs. The anticipation that this is going to be a source of inefficiency, or alternatively, that governance structure is going to become increasingly hierarchical, where you're going to have some centralization of management decision-making, maybe through an elected board or some sort of smaller group of decision-makers. Well, in the case of Union Cab, it's actually sort of gone in the opposite direction. Over time, the governance has become increasingly participatory. So, in addition to a board of directors, there are a range of maintenance, finance, education, elections, and HR committees that recommend policies to the board. There are a range of peer review councils, and even the management of day-to-day operations has shifted from individual managers to teams of worker members so for example, the maintenance division is no longer managed by an individual, but by a team of workers who are both maintenance people and drivers and dispatchers. So you have this diversified management structure. Approximately a third of the owners participate in some dimension of the governance of the business. So about 80 of the 240 worker owners are working in some piece of this business, in some piece of this governance process. So how efficient or inefficient is this? So it actually turns out that the members were interested in this question themselves, so they did an audit of their governance processes, looking at the actual cost of it. So in 2011, the company paid $86,000 for governance costs. They compensate their members for the time that they put in. So they compensated them about $86,000 for about 6,000 hours of work. So that's about 2 full-time employees at the cost of about $45,000 a year. So 2 managers to manage a $6 million a year business, paying them $45,000 a year, with an average of a worker contributing about 70 hours a year. To me, that doesn't sound highly inefficient. Doesn't sound like they're being overcompensated. It doesn't seem like it's an undue burden on anyone. So to what can we attribute this seemingly relatively efficient governance process? Well, it's difficult for me to say based on sort of the limited research I did, but I think that one interesting dimension of the governance process is an extensive set of conflict resolution mechanisms that they have. So they have an accident review committee, they have a mediation committee, they have a workers' council, they have a stewards' council, and a lot of these institutions come out of that union tradition that they have. But one possible interpretation is that what those conflict resolution mechanisms do is they separate out individual interests from organizational interests. So imagine a worker is in the marketing committee and they're considering some proposal to market to a particular industry. They feel like their interests are not being heard. Well, they can either hash it out in the marketing committee and extend the length of that meeting by 4 hours, or they can go to the mediation committee. And by the way, in their audit of their governance practices, that included the conflict resolution mechanisms. So maybe that's one explanation of this relatively efficient process. So I'm gonna leave it there. I think there are a lot of other dimensions of this case to be studied. I think it's a very interesting case. But again, just to sort of rehash, Those two pieces, the foundation of the business and the governance process, I think are important dimensions of worker cooperatives to consider. And context seems to be important, and non-material benefits on the foundation side. And in terms of governance, maybe conflict resolution is something that we should be thinking about more. So thank you.
So finally, we have Dottie Ives Dewey from the Department of Geography and Planning at Westchester University to speak about green saw design and build. Please bear with us for a moment. I'll get some tech support.
It's possible I made it worse.
What did you do?
I just was hitting.
So they're sending someone down to fix this for us.
There. The others were projecting from here.
I think the issue might be he did something here before. Show present. Said he was coming over.
So while we're waiting, I was going to say some comments at the end, so maybe I can just say those comments now in anticipation of what Dottie was going to say. A few things that I observe in reading these cases and going over these cases that are common and interesting. One, context matters. That the Madison context is really quite unique in the sense that they have a community of people who are really deeply committed to these issues, and that was as easy as stunned. All right, so I will hold my comments, and Dottie, if you can come up, we're put to shame. Yeah.
Fantastic. After all that, I hope the visuals are worth it. Yeah. It was worth it just to see him come in and push that one button. Good morning. I'm sorry for the delay, and Craig, I'm sorry to cut you off as you're starting your concluding remarks. But my name is Dottie Ives Dewey, and I'm from Westchester University. I'm in the Geography and Planning Department. My field is really urban planning. And I was thrilled to be invited to participate in this conference and in this entire project. In doing one of the case studies, I did the case study of green saw design and build. And just so you have a little context with some of what I was, the lens I was looking through, because my background is in urban planning, I was kind of taking a planning focus and looking at issues related to community development. So my the company that I studied, that I did the case study for, is called Green Saw Design and Build. Green Saw is a worker cooperative, one of the few worker cooperatives in Philadelphia. This company is located in Northern Liberties in Philadelphia. Their core business is they do custom renovations, they're custom contractors, but they specialize in architectural salvage. So they take materials from demolitions and other renovation projects, they refinish them, and then they install them into new residential and commercial renovations. I have, it's kind of at the bottom here, but an image. They do very high-end type of projects. The company is relatively new. The company itself was established in 2006. And it was only recently converted to a worker co-op. It was established as the conversion was completed in 2011, just around this time last year. So they've only been operating as a worker co-op now for 1 year. So another focus that I took in doing this case study was in looking at the challenges that co-ops face in those very formative early stages. All right. I'm assuming many of you are from Philadelphia, but those of you who are not familiar with Philadelphia, just a little background on the Northern Liberties section where Green Saw is located. Northern Liberties is kind of bounded by Spring Garden and Girard Avenue, north and south, and then 6th Street down to the Delaware River. It's a neighborhood adjacent to Old City. And Northern Liberties used to be an industrial area of town, kind of known for their big industrial breweries, but it has significantly transformed in recent years, and as we would consider a well-gentrified area today. And today it has a healthy balance of business and residential, and you'll find a number of boutique stores and art galleries and small startup businesses, and anyway, so it's a very different town today. But this is where Green Saw is located. So, what about the company itself? Green Saw operates around the core principles of green building. I mean, what they do is true green building. I mean, their motto is just keep stuff out of the landfill. So they take things, they refinish. What they can't use from what they can't use from salvage operations, they source from the region so that they can, in all of their installations, they can point to the history of the materials that they install and identify where it was sourced. They also value their client relationships. They have a strong emphasis on client collaboration. Quality, they're known for quality craftsmanship. In making the switch to a worker co-op, of course, they value workplace democracy. And then they also value community relationships, their relationships with the local community in Northern Liberties, with other green builders. So these are all principles that are self-reinforcing. Okay. A little bit of background on how they grew to become a worker cooperative. Green Saw was originally founded by one individual, Brendan Jones, who had started the company on his own as a limited liability corporation in 2006. And he set it up as a design-build operation, but was looking for something more. Was looking for an organization that would be more green, more sustainable, and more humanistic. And he happened to fall upon, I think story goes, he read an article about the South Mountain Company and ended up finding a reference to this book, which some of you might be familiar with, called Companies We Keep, which documents the experience of the South Mountain Company in Martha's Vineyard, which is another design-build worker cooperative that's well established and has been quite successful in Martha's Vineyard. And it was very inspired by the experience of the South Mountain Company. And the model resonated with Jones because he reasoned that they were sort of already operating that way. He recognized he had highly talented individuals that were working for him that had options to go to any number of places. And he wanted to reward them for their work and wanted to create a more democratic, a truly, authentically democratic environment. So that was one motivation in making the transition to a cooperative. But he had another motivation, which was that he was a successful writer. And he wanted to have the opportunity to free himself from the day-to-day responsibilities of management. So that was another driving force in making the shift to a cooperative. It was about a 2-year, from the time that they decided to do it, it was about a 2-year transition process. They formed a founders committee in 2009, and the founders committee was charged with making some of the fundamental decisions regarding the conversion, crafting the governance structure, the management structure, the leadership and decision-making structure, establishing membership rights and membership responsibilities, determining the path to membership. I mean, one of the big questions was valuing the company and establishing the buyout and the arrangements for how people could become owners. And they ultimately agreed to a $100,000 buyout, and that owners could be invited to join after working for the company for 3 years, and it would be a $3,500 buy-in, which could be paid in $500 installments over 7 years. So these types of decisions were made by the Founders Committee. They had a great model, so they ended up actually modeling much of the structure of decision-making and governance around the experience of around the South Mountain Company. Okay. Where's the company today? Today, the company has 14 employees. When they initially converted to a co-op, in addition to Jones, three of the employees at that time were offered ownership. Only one took up the offer. Two turned it down. One of those two ended up leaving the company, and the other one is still an employee, and he still has not accepted the invitation of ownership. And we'll talk about some of the reasons for that in just a minute, because I think it provides some interesting insights. Their market is largely Philadelphia. It's a very local company. They've been trying to move out into the suburbs, and they've been having some success with this, but they are pretty much grounded in Philadelphia. They reported revenues in 2011 of about $1.5 million, and based on that, they had revenues of about $10,000, so that's kind of the size of the company. They've had a number of challenges as a startup, and I think that in having this larger discussion about worker cooperatives for companies that are making a conversion, I think the Greensall provides some interesting lessons. There were substantial upfront costs in making the conversion, as we've talked about already in a number of the case studies. The legal costs, the financial costs, figuring out the accounting. They could not have done it without some pro bono support that they received from attorneys, from an accountant, from financial folks who were willing to donate their time to be able to support them in making the conversion. One of the biggest issues in regard to the potential owners and whether or not they wanted to join was how to share risk and reward. This is a company that has had a history of unsteady revenues. With the business that they're in, they're very vulnerable to the fluctuations of the economy. And one of the biggest issues was identifying and detailing the extent of the personal liability. The company had still has outstanding debt. They have a loan, they have a line of credit, which today they need to operate. And the new owners coming in, it was hard to quantify what exactly would be the extent of their liability. Do you backtrack losses? And it's still somewhat unclear, and that's problematic. That was one of the biggest concerns on this one person who was one employee who was invited to become an owner. That's one of the big reasons he has opted to not become an owner at this time. And there are also some issues with personality and interpersonal dynamics at the early stage, and you're sort of jumping into something, taking on some risks that you don't fully understand. And there has to be a lot of trust that goes along with that. And that's been an issue with Greensaw as well in this early stage. So just some preliminary conclusions. I'm going to take up all the discussion time. It's a great model. I mean, as we know, it's a great model. It's there to further their principles of sustainability, workplace democracy, commitment to the community. These all reinforce each other, and it has great potential. But in establishing a worker cooperative, it takes time. These things emerge over time, and it takes resources. The transition period can be long, and it can be expensive. There were a few, in this case, one key individual that championed the process, and I imagine that's probably the case in the formation of most cooperatives, that you need to have those key individuals that just keep, fighting the fight to make it happen. And finding resources to help with the transition. Again, I think that's come up a number of times. So, but two, essential pillars to make a business like this work: trust and profitability. I'm not sure that this would have happened had the time been different and the company had not had positive revenues. So I will leave it with that.
Okay, I'll just finish my remarks. I'll keep them very brief because we have about 10 minutes for question and answers, and I'm sure they'd be happy to elaborate on their cases. I just wanted to make 3 quick points. One, that I think you see common throughout these cases, as well as most of these cases of worker cooperatives, but also other cooperatives, is the importance and significance of context. And it's a dialectical context. That is, that the context helps make these cooperatives possible. But when the cooperatives are thriving, they contribute to the context that then feeds back into building more cooperatives. And we know, internationally, historically, the most successful examples of worker cooperatives, and for that matter, other kinds of cooperatives, are those where they are nested within a supportive environment, where they're clustered together and find ways to feed one another. And that is in some ways the challenge. It's a challenge that we were facing in Philadelphia. We wanted to learn from Madison on this regard. How do you build a supportive policy structure, financial structure, and educational structure to make this possible? A second remark, we didn't go out and try to find eclectic worker cooperatives. These are very different worker cooperatives in different parts of the sector, producing intermediate goods, services, high-end goods, sort of consumer goods like coffee. The reality is that there aren't very many worker cooperatives out there, and the field is eclectic, and that's because a lot of it depends upon individuals taking this charismatic initiative to start them. And part of the reason that it's only a few individuals that are doing this is because they aren't taught how to do cooperatives in the business schools. It's not a model where people are familiar with it, so it's intimidating. It's frightening. And then a third final comment is the significance of innovation. One of the classic critiques of the early 20th century of worker cooperatives is that they end up being conservative, that they don't innovate because they don't face the same kind of pressures, the capitalist pressures that drive innovation. But we see in these examples how important innovation is for the actual model. Sort of being cutting edge with regard to the coffee industry, cutting edge with regard to the other industries. I think that is central to the worker cooperative's futures. Okay, so we have a couple or one microphone. Please step up.
Thank you very much. Just a question, well, 2 questions. One, a little technical question, if you could qualify what you said about the substantial membership fee at Isthmus Engineering. Just on terminology, I just want to be clear. This is fee or an equity investment. And if and when a employee who's a member owner quits, do they get some or all or possibly even more than they invested back, depending on the valuation of the company and how long they've been in? So that was one question. And then overall, for anybody who still wants to answer, would like to answer it, would be the amount of sort of hand-holding and or nurturing or assistance, outside assistance that is needed, because I think we have to be realistic in terms of developing. It's something we want to do here in Philadelphia more. And so in terms of the type of assistance that's needed from your experiences in Madison and in Philadelphia, what is needed to help worker co-ops develop and grow and start?
All right, I'll try to do a quick summary of the financial investment that Bob asked about. So in worker cooperatives, like other cooperatives, there's sort of two ways to invest in the organization. One is upfront with a cash investment when you become a member, and the other is through a reinvestment of the profits of the organization. And in most worker co-ops, partly because of the tax structure for cooperatives in general, part of the profits sort of are that a co-op or any business, but a co-op holds on to at the end of the year for reinvestment are held in an account with a member's name attached to it. And so the member will pay taxes on those profits eventually, income taxes. But while the while the profit is held in the co-op itself and a member's name is attached to it, the cooperative does not have to pay tax on it. And so that is an advantage. And this is true for all cooperatives, not just worker. So the question about the investment that the members, potential members of Isthmus make, what they have said is that traditionally they've pegged it to the price of a small car. So right now it's about $15,000. And as I said, you work for the company for 2 years, you get to know it, you make a decision. Is this an organization that I want to invest in? And they believe that they have never had a member who has been turned away or not applied for membership because they couldn't afford it. So they pay fairly well at this organization, they have good benefits, and they ask for this contribution. When a member leaves, they get that contribution back, that $15,000, plus their share of the profits in a somewhat complex sort of algorithm where they have tried to preserve the financial health of the organization and return some of the individual assets to the members when they do retire. So. Comment on Bob's question about helping co-ops?
To respond as quickly as possible, it seems that the financing piece is really important, not necessarily for complete financing, but to have some quasi-public institution or some institution that's more familiar with a cooperative model that can at least do maybe evaluation of a worker co-op. The other comment I was going to make on that note was all businesses need resources, whether worker co-ops or privately held businesses. Talk to, people doing startups, and they're going to angel investors and they're going to chambers of commerce and trying to get business advice. So it's not just worker co-ops that need handholding. All businesses need handholding. And then the other thing I was going to say is about finding the right communities of individuals who want to form worker co-ops and have shared goals and have shared experiences and are committed to each other.
Too many worker co-ops, but there is the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops. So there is a website if you're interested in lots of resources about how to get them started. We have as many resources as we can put out there. It's usworker.coop. So just Bob about the local support. So, thank you.
Thanks for that resource. I had questions about business. I made an assumption that the executive committee is where the president, the vice president, where they live in that committee. How are they selected? That's the first question. And why are not the general managers and the marketers a part of the co-op? I got the impression that they were not invited to be members.
Right.
Why is that?
Yeah, to the first question, the executives are those are officers that are elected annually by the membership, and everybody, all 30 members are on the board, so that rotates through. They rotate through those offices fairly quickly. And in worker co-ops, it's really not across, it's a decision that every worker co-op makes whether they want to have their managers on the board or not. And I think at Isthmus, their sense is that these are positions which have an authority over the workers in some way, and they want to make sure that the workers also have authority over them. So that and legally, the true power, ultimate power in any organization remains with the board of directors. And so by not having the sales manager and the general manager part of that board of directors, they maintain that strong checks and balances. But I will say that unlike some other co-ops, the compensation level and the authority is not differentiated strongly. So this is not a general manager who has a salary that is way above all the workers and has responsibilities that are CEO-like.
Okay, and that actually speaks to my second and last question, and I think maybe Trevor might actually, Trevor, you triggered the question. You said something about kind of a two-track process for problem solving and conflict inside of the organization. You said that if somebody on the marketing committee has an issue, can't get heard, doesn't feel heard, that they can argue it out in the marketing committee, or they can go to their HR / employee relations group, I guess, to discuss it. And what the thought came to my mind is, well, what is the diversity composition? I'm a little bit familiar with Wisconsin's demography, so I'm just wondering, what does diversity look like really across the board in any of the co-ops?
To my limited knowledge, it seems like there is some diversity. They pride themselves on claiming to be an open and accepting workforce, and so they talk about sexual orientation and political interests. I think that there's very limited racial diversity. That might have to do with the demographic in general, but I am not certain about that. But one of the workers talked to me about how she's a gay woman herself and how this is a particularly open and inclusive environment for that.
I'm sorry, we are out of time and we have a tight schedule. We have to make sure we get that 30-minute lunch. Let me remind you of a couple things. One, there will be another panel on worker cooperatives in the afternoon. Please bring your questions there. Second, you can come speak to these people, and they would love to talk about their cases, I'm sure. Or if you want to contact them via email or something, contact the organizers. We can put you in touch so they can answer your questions. And finally, Kayla Hayesen will help direct people to the session on credit unions, which is one of the breakout sessions.
That's room 3304, and Kelly Hayesen is in the other Geary auditorium, waiting for anybody who wants to come over there. She was setting up for the next conference over there. She's ready to take people over. Right.
So we have about 7 minutes before the next session. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to chat.
Is this on? Let's get started. My name's Michelle Kondo. I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'll be presenting in the next worker